the dual innervation of the autonomic nervous system. We cannot have homeostasis without both of these influences. Think about your heart. If the sympathetic system took over, your heart rate would skyrocket, right? If we didn't have the parasympathetic system, that would be a disaster in terms of homeostasis. But because we have both of those divisions of the nervous system balancing each other out, we can effectively bring about homeostasis. All right, so this image helps us to understand the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. And this is a schematic representation. So this is not how it is in the body, but this is going to help us make sense of what's going on. So on the left, what we're seeing is the spinal cord and the sympathetic nerves that are going to these various target organs. So we spoke about several different processes, several different target organs that are affected by the autonomic nervous system. You have your lacrimal glands, which produce tears. You have your lungs, your heart, your liver, which produce some gastric secretions, your intestines, your bladder, which is going to be your urinary production, and genitalia, and so on. So these organs in the middle are influenced by both the sympathetic division on the left and the parasympathetic division on the right. Now, the sympathetic fibers are coming specifically from T1 to L2, okay? The sympathetic fibers arise specifically from that region of the spinal cord, those spinal nerves, T1 to L2. Whereas on the parasympathetic side, we have fibers arising from the cranial outflow, so cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and then your sacral spinal nerves, right? Your sacral spinal nerves. As a result, we usually call the sympathetic outflow the thoracolumbar because it's involving the thoracic nerves and L1 and 2, which are parts of the lumbar nerves. And we usually call the parasympathetic division the craniosacral outflow because we're involving the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and then sacral nerves S2, S3, and S4. All right, so just to recap here, this image shows us the areas of the spinal cord and of the brain, because these cranial nerves are originating in the medulla. So the areas of the spinal cord and the brain that give rise to the fibers of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side. Right? And we'll continue to refer to that image as we move on. Now, moving on, we have two types of neurons that go from the central nervous system out to the effector organs. We have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. We saw this anatomy before. This is something that we've seen before. Now, these two neurons are going to synapse at a ganglia where they will communicate with each other. This is called an autonomic ganglia, okay? And just to clarify here, a ganglia is anytime we have cell bodies that are not in the central nervous system. So an autonomic ganglia is basically where a neuron, an axon terminal, synapses onto a cell body. And this is not taking place inside the central nervous system. This is out. This is the peripheral nervous system, right? So the synapse or the cell bodies that are located outside of the central nervous system are what we call ganglia. The autonomic ganglia are specifically where the preganglionic autonomic fibers interact with the postganglionic autonomic fibers. Alrighty, and we'll see that in an image coming up. Now, the effector organs of the autonomic system are many. We talked about this before, just now. We have the cardiac muscle, we have smooth muscle, we have glandular tissue, and we have adipose tissue. Right, so these are the parts of the body that we're not voluntarily controlling. We cannot control our smooth muscle. We cannot dilate or constrict our respiratory airway. We cannot dilate or constrict consciously our blood vessels, right? So that's your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, your glands, and the adipose. So let's look at the general anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Any questions so far? So when we look at the autonomic nervous system, there's the central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of that. Okay. So we have our spinal cord here. Right. Let's just draw this here. And then we have our first neuron. This is your preganglionic neuron. Okay. And that is going to synapse here onto a second neuron. Which will synapse onto some effector tissue. And as we mentioned earlier, this effector tissue can be cardiac muscle, right, which will affect your heart rate. We're going to see a lot of how this is brought about when we look at the cardiovascular system. For exam 4, this can be smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is all over the body. Right? It's in your blood vessels, it's in your gastrointestinal tract, it's in your airways, and so on and so forth. This can also be glandular tissue, so your glands, your salivary glands, your pancreas, your liver, these are all glandular tissue which are under the influence of the autonomic nervous system. And then finally, adipose tissue or fat, right? Adipose tissue, as we'll see, is specifically with the sympathetic. There's no parasympathetic innervation to the adipose tissue, all right? So this first neuron was preganglionic. This second neuron will be your postganglionic neuron. And then the area where they're synapsing, if you remember, I just mentioned the connection of cell bodies that are not in the central nervous system. These are called ganglia. And specifically the connection between preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, this is called your autonomic ganglia. Okay. This can occur in several different locations, and we're going to talk about that coming up. But the synapse between your preganglionic neuron and your postganglionic neuron, which takes place in the peripheral nervous system, is called your autonomic ganglia. Ready? Okay. Another point worth mentioning here is that fibers of the autonomic nervous system arise from the lateral horn of the spinal cord. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail coming up, but this is the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Alrighty, any questions? Any questions? Okay, so this image just recaps what we just mentioned. We have our spinal cord in the central nervous system. Spinal cord is a part of the central nervous system. Fibers leave the spinal cord, travel out to the peripheral nervous system. This is your first neuron, your preganglionic neuron. It's going to synapse onto a second neuron, your postganglionic neuron. The area where they synapse is your autonomic ganglia. that second neuron is going to then travel out to some distal peripheral tissue, which we call your effector organ. Right? And we talked about some of those examples.